Hi there, 8th graders. This is Chapter 19 about World War II, Section 4, War on the Home Front. To defeat the Axis powers, United States citizens from all walks of life committed to the war effort. I'm beginning reading on page 599. Do follow along. Americans were amazed at the speed with which industry turned to making war materials. When in May 1940, President Roosevelt talked of producing 50,000 airplanes a year, some thought he was asking for the impossible. Yet by 1944, the number of planes produced annually had risen to about 100,000. Mass production was so effective in the ship industry that the average time for building a freighter dropped from a year to less than 2 months. The production battle. As in World War I, federal agencies took on the direction of private companies doing war work. After a Senate investigation revealed corruption and mismanagement among companies involved in war production, in January 1942, Roosevelt gave a War Production Board strong regulatory power. Its head, Donald Nelson, could seize vital materials, order industrial plants to convert to war production, and prohibit manufacture of products he considered non-essential to the war effort. Rapid conversion to war production. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, production of bicycles, beer cans, refrigerators, toothpaste tubes, and more than 300 other items was cut back or banned. Automobile manufacturers were ordered to convert production to tanks and other war supplies. Entire new industries were created. Synthetic rubber, for example, became important when Japan's conquest of Southeast Asia cut off America's supply of natural rubber. By the end of 1942, nearly 33% of American production went to war materials, and by 1944, nearly 50%. Production of all goods nearly doubled, and America's production of war materials matched the total output of Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. In May 1941, Roosevelt set up the Office of Scientific Research and Development to mobilize science and technology for the war effort. Among the many inventions that came from this agency were DDT, which controlled insects and made jungle fighting more tolerable, the bazooka, a weapon that enabled an infantry soldier to destroy a tank, and radar, which determined the position and speed of airplanes and ships. Financing the war. How do you pay for a war? To raise funds for the war effort, the federal government increased taxes and sold war bonds in amounts ranging from $25,000 to $10,000. In 1942, the government extended the income tax for the first time to include middle and lower income people. To make collection easier, the government in 1943 began to require that employers deduct taxes from workers' paychecks before they received them. The war increased employment, and workers' earnings rose as war production brought longer work weeks and overtime. As people had more money to spend, and as the shift to war materials made consumer goods scarce, prices rose. To combat inflation, in 1942, Congress created the Office of Price Administration, which set price ceilings on consumer products and began to ration goods that were in short supply. By war's end, 20 items, including sugar, meat, butter, coffee, gasoline, fuel oil, and shoes, required government-issued rationing coupons to be presented at the time of purchase. Despite attempts to hold down prices, however, the cost of living rose nearly 29% during the war, leading to demands for higher wages. To help prevent strikes, a National War Labor Board was established to settle labor disputes by mediation, although this task was made easier by the no-strike pledges that both the AFL and CIO made after Pearl Harbor. There were many small wildcat strikes, work stoppages without union approval, and a short national strike by 500,000 coal miners. Even though most labor unions kept their no-strike pledge, an act passed in 1947 outlawed strikes against war industries. The war and social change. The need for defense workers altered traditional patterns of American society. As millions of men joined the armed services, more women than ever before entered the labor force. "If you can drive a car, you can run a machine," became an advertising slogan for industries. Women assume non-traditional roles. The government, newspapers, radios, and newsreels encouraged women to take factory jobs as a patriotic duty, and 5 million American women entered the workforce during the war. Rosie the Riveter, who first appeared in overhauls in a Lockheed aircraft poster, became a national symbol of the vital contribution of women were making to the war effort. More than ever before, women filled jobs that were not traditional for females. They worked on production lines, in steel mills, on the docks, and in other jobs that required heavy manual labor. Outside war industries, women also took over such traditionally male jobs, such as driving buses and trucks, and working as train conductors, lumberjacks, and barbers. Most of these new workers were married and had children. Yet women still encountered resistance from male workers. As one female aircraft worker described it, "The men really resented the women very much. After a while, they realized it was essential that the women worked there because there wasn't enough men, and the women were doing a great job." To encourage women to work, the government offered job training courses, and Congress appropriated funds for child care centers, but even this was not enough to meet the need. Federal and state governments suspended laws that limited the hours women could work, and women's wages rose as the concept of equal pay for equal work spread. Although at first most women considered their new employment to be temporary, by war's end, 80% said they wanted to keep their jobs. Opportunities for African Americans. The need for workers also speeded the shift of African Americans from farming to manufacturing. Many African Americans left the South and moved to cities in the Northeast, Midwest, and California to work in war industries. Some companies hired few African Americans before the war, but by 1945, thousands of African Americans had jobs in defense plants. Resentment toward social change. Between 1941 and 1945, 1 of every 5 Americans relocated to another part of the country. The movement of so many Americans to fill jobs in war industries created housing shortages, crowded schools, and heightened social tensions. Old-timers resented the newcomers, regardless of their race. In California, there were prejudices against Okies, white migrants from Oklahoma and Texas, who arrived in the 1930s to look for work after losing their farms in the Dust Bowl. In many cities, prejudices arose against newly arrived African Americans. The police were needed to help African American families move into public housing in Detroit when angry mobs tried to block them. It took federal troops to break a strike of streetcar operators in Philadelphia who protested against the promotion of African American workers. The federal government's response to racial discrimination during the war was uneven. In 1941, African American labor leader A. Philip Randolph threatened to lead 100,000 protesters on Washington, D.C. to demand an end to discrimination in defense jobs in the armed forces. In order to stop the march, Roosevelt established the Fair Employment Practices Commission to promote minority hiring in government offices and in companies that had war contracts. But while it opposed discrimination, the commission did not reject segregation. Even the military remained segregated, and although hundreds of thousands of African Americans served in uniform in every capacity from cooks to fighter pilots, most served in all-black units. Detention of Japanese Americans. The most significant racial discrimination in the war involved the removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. About 90% of all Japanese Americans outside Hawaii lived in California and the Pacific Northwest. Because of immigration restrictions after 1924, 2/3 had been born in the U.S. and were citizens by birth. Yet government officials were suspicious of their loyalty. When war broke out, residents of California, Oregon, and Wisconsin and Washington feared that with the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor severely damaged, they were vulnerable to invasion at any time. Californians in particular were concerned that their neighbors of Japanese descent might engage in sabotage. Army General John DeWitt investigated and reported that the Japanese race is an enemy race, and while many second and third generation Japanese born on American soil have become Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted. It therefore follows that along the Pacific coast, over 112,000 potential enemies of Japanese extraction are at large today. Based on such reports, beginning in February 1942, the government removed 110,000 Japanese Americans to detention centers surrounded by barbed wire and patrolled by soldiers and confined them there for the duration of the war. The order to evacuate Japanese Americans from the West Coast came quickly. Detainees had as little as 48 hours to make arrangements for their homes, businesses, and farms. Many had to sell their property at a loss or abandon it. Bargain hunters descended on them, taking advantage of their plight. Arriving at one of 10 detention camps in isolated areas of Utah, Wyoming, Arizona, and other sparsely settled western states, they were put to work at menial, low-paying jobs. Their military guards searched their quarters for weapons, sometimes confiscating kitchen knives, scissors, and even knitting needles. Entire families lived out the war in a single room in Army-style barracks furnished with cots and bare light bulbs. Since the authorities had no plans for running the camps, the detainees established their own camp governments, schools, and newspapers. Almost immediately, detainees appealed to the courts to protect their rights. When the issue came before the Supreme Court in December of 1944 in Korematsu versus the United States, the justices upheld the government's policy as necessary for national security. Despite their unhappy experience, most Japanese Americans remained loyal to the United States. Thousands served in segregated military units. A Japanese American Army unit recruited from detention camps fought in the Italian campaign and was the Army's most decorated unit in American military history. However, the government's policy toward Japanese Americans at home became a blot on the nation's war effort. Thanks for listening.